Today, Hurricane Walton is working its way up the East Coast. Not sure exactly where it's going to land or where it will impart its destruction on the U.S. or Canada. 10 years ago, last month, the United States suffered one of the worst natural disasters we have ever seen. Hurricane Katrina made landfall in southern Louisiana as a Category 5 hurricane with winds at 175 miles an hour. Over 1,200 people died, and millions of people lost their homes and belongings to the storm. The entire Gulf Coast region and the entire U.S. saw either firsthand or via the nightly news the suffering that was taking place. But we don't need to look back to our past to see our suffering. As we speak, people in this, our own congregation, are suffering. Suffering with disease, terminal illness, mental illness, loss, and many other issues that affect each of us. Most of us can think of a time in our recent past when we have suffered. Suffering is a common and widespread part of human existence. Oswald Chambers, a 20th century preacher, in his book, Church Discipline, says this about suffering. Suffering is the heritage of the bad, of the penitent, and of the Son of God. Each one ends in the cross. The bad thief is crucified. The penitent thief is crucified. And the Son of God is crucified. By these signs, we know the widespread heritage of suffering. Suffering is beyond human understanding. We cannot see the whole picture of suffering, so we cannot know the reasons behind that suffering. But what we do know is that God came down to earth, became human in Jesus, and suffered along with humanity. God suffered while hanging and dying on the cross, just as all of humanity suffers. God knows what suffering is. And as a result of God's suffering on the cross, we can learn that suffering is an inescapable part of creation. Like we heard in the story of Job this morning, when we suffer, we have choices to make. We could do what Job's wife said and not accept the suffering, curse God, and die. Or we can do what Job did, which is turn to God. Job, a man with integrity, when talked to by his wife, says something to the effect of, shouldn't we accept the good with the bad? Now, many people struggle with that question. Should we accept the good and the bad? After the death of his wife, C.S. Lewis, a well-known Christian author, wrote in his journal that he was questioning not whether God existed, but whether God was really a good God. I believe we can all remember a time when we questioned God and what was happening to us, just as either C.S. Lewis or Job's wife did. But Job does not turn away from God, even in the midst of his suffering. Job turns and looks at God directly and explains that the good comes with the bad. It's that choice of turning toward God that's important for us today. Job chose his faith in God over an easy out. And so there are a few lessons that we might be able to learn from this. Excuse me. Choosing faith in the midst of suffering won't eliminate the pain. Job chose to follow God and kept his faith in God. While his decision was a decision with integrity, it didn't eliminate the torture and the pain that he was going to go through. And so when we are suffering, we too can look to God for help. We'll gain strength in our faith and our knowledge of God. But the pain and the suffering will still be present. Choosing faith in the midst of suffering will not stop the questions that we have or provide reasons for our suffering. When Job chose his faith in God, it did not stop the people from questioning him, or even stop him from questioning why this was happening. It merely allowed him a safe place to address the questions. And similarly, when we look to God, our faith will help us, but it won't give us the answers to our questions. But choosing faith in God in the midst of suffering will remind us that God is in control. Now, this is a difficult one because it requires that we choose faith and trust the very God who allows the suffering in the first place. But Job chose God. And while he wasn't aware of it at the time, God was in control the entire time. And we must also realize that God is in control of our lives. Further, choosing faith in the midst of suffering will be a rare gift from God. If we're able to sing the praises of God when we're having good days, should we not be able to sing the praises of God when we're having bad days, when things aren't going our way? God created everything around us. Therefore, by singing His praises in the midst of torment and chaos, it reminds us of the good in all of creation. And finally, choosing faith in the midst of suffering will bring us closer to God. Job didn't know it, but through his trials, he was entering into a relationship with God that would bring him closer than ever to God. If we look at Scripture, Abraham, Joseph, Moses, and many other people in the Bible spend decades suffering only to end up in a closer relationship with God. During times of suffering and chaos, staying in a relationship with God allows us to see how God works through others and us. Because the suffering we currently face will lead us to a closer relationship with God. So the story of Job, as well as the story of Hurricane Katrina, can be seen as stories with untold suffering. Suffering of God's people for no rhyme or reason. Now, some people may say that God has a plan and that suffering is part of that plan. Now, I disagree that suffering is part of God's plan. But I do agree that God has a plan, And that plan is for the redemption of all creation, through inviting us to live into our new, transformed lives of a risen Christ. So the next time you or a loved one are staring at the face of suffering, choose your faith in the midst of it and look to God.